joining us, Matt Houston from Houston Financial and Brad Wallace from Stride Bank. And so we are really excited to share some things with you guys that have been important to us lately. So when Matt and Brad and I were visiting not long ago, we had a common theme that our clients were asking us. What do we do when this economy turns? What do we do with our stuff? How do we protect our assets? What active steps can we do to play a little defense? And so as we began to put our heads together and really realize that this is a common theme, whether it's investments or insurance or estate planning, we know that our clients are facing an uncertainty. And business loves certainty. And so when we're growing and we're playing offense, and when you guys play offense with your assets, and when you play offense and you're growing your business, it makes total sense to be focused on that. It was interesting when Matt and I were talking about this. Matt says most of his entire practice is playing a little bit of defense and being aware of that. So we're going to hear some of his insurance strategies here in just a second to help with that. What we talk about here today is not a one-size-fits-all. So these are just concepts and ideas that we want to plant a seed for you. We want to have a conversation with you. We want you to maybe ask questions. If you have an insurance agent already, that's great. If you have an investment professional already, that's great. If you have an estate planning attorney, that's great. We don't want to take their spot. But if you don't, we would love the opportunity to visit with you so you can learn more about what you need and where you want to go for you and your family. So today what we're going to do, we're going to take about 10 minutes apiece, talk a little bit about our areas of specialty, but what we also want to do is we'll be around afterwards for you guys to visit with us one-on-one, to talk about your family, where you are, where you want to be. And maybe some of you guys, I know there's some faces out here that represent clients, and so maybe if you have a client that might fit from an insurance perspective or investment perspective, we would love to hear from you. So we'll be around afterwards for that. Again, Brad Wallace with Stride Wealth Management, Matt Houston with Houston Financial, and I'm Brian Hill with Morse, Lowe. I'll go through these and real quick, but I want you guys to point out something. I want to point out something really obvious. My description's a lot shorter than theirs, right? So they've done a lot more than I have. So I'm just going to leave it at that. If you guys want to go out and check that out, Brad and Matt are experts in their field. They've got a great reputation in the community. And so right now, I want to introduce Matt. Matt and Houston Financial have been around for a long time. We were just trying to do math earlier and realized we don't do math in public very well. But Houston Financial has deep roots in this community that have really benefited their clients over the long term. And so really excited to hear what Matt has to say about insurance.
So I baited a couple of my buddies to come up here so they clap, so thanks guys. So I like that this is where they put me first so I can talk to you about dying, becoming disabled, or having a long-term care event. So that's super fun to kick this off, right? That's the fun and sexy stuff. And I'll keep this, my thought was for this is to kind of just take you through a couple things that we've done. My dad and I have been around 32 years. We've just seen a lot in our 32 years. I get to lean on his experiences. I get some of my own experiences. And so how that kind of ties into clients that have had really successful outcomes by being proactive and doing things with insurance and risk management planning, and then how we've seen some things maybe not go so well for clients and what mistakes maybe they made, and we can learn and be better for the next client down the road. So I'll hit 3 topics. Some will apply, might be interesting, some might be boring, but I won't spend much time on each. So, and then at the end, if you got questions, feel free to fire away. But Cameron and Josh, thank you for inviting me. Brian, obviously, thanks for having me. So I hope that I do a good job. Don't screw this up. So anyway, so let's skip into life insurance. One of the things, I would argue, I think we're experts in the life insurance game. Super fun to talk about because we're talking about you're not here on earth anymore, but it is a selfless act. It's something you're doing something for somebody else. So what you probably wouldn't know, or things that I think people overlook when you think about your life insurance plan, is there's a lot of moving parts going on right now that you probably don't see. And if you do see, you've got to scrub this stuff to really find it. There's a significant amount of changes at the carrier level. Carriers are having significant challenges. This low interest rate environment that we've been in for a decade. I know we've moved out of it in the last 12 months, but these carriers don't get to pivot that fast. There has been a lot of pressure put on carriers. There's a lot of carriers that are getting downgraded left and right. There are a lot of carriers that are exiting products, often. And so, what my dad and I say all the time is no matter how good your quote-unquote product is in the life insurance space, if your carrier beats you to the grave, that's a bad deal for you. So you never want that. And people don't tend to do a due diligence review or an audit of the carrier. They just look past it. They just think, oh, Lincoln's a big company, they're doing great. No, they're not. They are quote-unquote a big company, but the next comment I just made, they're doing great, is not accurate. So, there's a lot of dynamics, and so we tell people all the time, you gotta kind of do an audit of your life insurance portfolio. So I always ask people questions like, when's the last time you did an audit of your carrier and your product? And you pierce through and look through, when was the last time you did an audit of your beneficiaries? I couldn't tell you how many times we've had policies where there's ex-wives or ex-husbands. I've had people that have policies with dead people as the beneficiaries. That doesn't work. So it's just, when did you shake the dust off of that thing and actually do a due diligence review of your product? I don't get into products, I'm not going to tell you a whole bunch about that, but just from a carrier perspective and a high level, you should be doing an audit. It doesn't have to be an every year event of the carrier specifically, the product you have, and you need to look through and put, is that trust the right beneficiary for that asset and that policy? When was the last time anybody looked at it? And is it even the right trust? Maybe you've created a new one that would better receive those proceeds and actually execute the things you want to have for your family. So, I do think there's a significant amount of stuff with that. One of the things, this is a statistic in my business that we track, and this is the only thing I'll say about 2 different types of products. And I don't care what product people have. I just have to understand them all. But the only type of life insurance that I like is the one that's enforced when you die. So it's my bias. I'd like to be enforced. Statistically speaking, in the whole broad scheme of things with all carriers across this industry, of all claims, so if you looked at all the claims of all the carriers on a life insurance perspective, 97% of claims are some form of whole life policy. So that's saying that 3% of term insurance policies pay out. These carriers are not dumb. They know how to price it, they know when to expire it, and they know how to get you to move out of that before they ever had to pay a claim. That being said, I own a whole bunch of term insurance because it's dirty cheap, and if I die today, my family is well taken care of because of that. But I'll tell you, statistically speaking, they pay claims on those products less than 3% of the time, which means it is a massive cash cow to the insurance company. So, just so you know that's an interesting dynamic people kind of think about. A couple other things I'll talk about on life insurance, and then I'm going to scoot through and hit these other subject matters. Estate planning, we use it a lot in estate planning. We do single life, we do second to die, and how that can fit and work with people like Brian, and how do you get this death benefit outside of your estate and put it in your irrevocable life insurance trust. There's some strategic ways to do that. It gets a little more complicated. You have to be working with a team of attorneys on that. But it is a very big part of our practice, and it's a big part of a lot of people's financial lives, especially people that have been blessed and have built up sizable estates. It can be an efficient tool and way to waterfall assets to the next generation and or pay your estate tax liability that right now is pretty generous, but changes in January of 26 and isn't as generous as it is today. Last point on life insurance that I'll tell you, so I was just thinking about these key points, is if you're in a partnership, you're in a business and you have a partner, and it's in your operating agreement that you have a buy-sell provision, just please, Jesus, to have a conversation with your partner about if one of us exits unexpectedly due to death, how are we buying out your ownership interest? And so we always ask people, do you have a buy-sell agreement? And typically they'll say, oh yeah, that's in my operating agreement. Great, cool, awesome. The second question that we ask that we very rarely get an answer to in a partnership is, well, is that buy-sell agreement funded? And the insurance is a very effective tool to fund that, so that if Trent, my buddy over here, and I own a business 50-50, and we're doing insurance together, and we're out there, and both of us are alive, we're going to do great, and everything's going to work, right? And then I drop dead unexpectedly. By law, his new partner is my wife. Trent does not have any interest in my wife as his business partner.
Amen.
She's not the best candidate to help you build and grow it. So Trent now gets 100% of the responsibilities, right? And yet he has to send a check every month to my wife for 50% of my ownership value. Or he can go get a loan from the bank, which is slightly expensive right now with interest rates, to buy that out. And there's just there's an insurance opportunity there that can solve a lot of that and make it very seamless, where you avoid the risk of having an unwanted or disinterested partner. And so it gets overlooked all the time because nobody talks about it. But when everybody's healthy, happy, and getting along, you should have this conversation. Because if you don't, and then something happens, it is so challenging to that surviving partner, in that partnership. So it's just a piece of the puzzle that we see all the time with our clients that own businesses that just gets overlooked so dramatically. And then it doesn't get overlooked when either your partner gets a really bad diagnosis at the doctor, and then you go into like crisis control. You can't do anything about it because it's uninsurable now, or worst case, they pass away. So I'm not trying to scare you. I'm just trying to tell you these are things that we've seen where we've had significant challenges put on families and businesses that we work with. And then we've had things really go seamless because we had a plan in place with the right documents, with the right assets funding it. So shifting, I'm going to shift to disability insurance. It gets slightly overlooked a lot in the world, but disability insurance is arguably in your earning years is one of your greatest financial risks you have, statistically speaking. It was the number one reason for foreclosures in the United States of America until we ran into that thing called 2008. So, and it ran the gamut for the longest time as one of the biggest risks. We do a lot of disability insurance planning for people as they're building assets, and I think about what Brian's talking about asset protection and putting fences around dollars and just defensive planning. This is defensive planning because when we see people, if they don't have an effective disability plan with some time and long-term care too, is, well, you do have one. It's your own assets. And what we would define as the burn rate on those assets, if you don't have a plan in place that comes in to take care, of those expenses that still exist if you became sick or injured, the burn rate on those dollars is real. And you will exhaust resources at mock speed if you don't have a plan in place. And that's a scary proposition. And so when on disability, when we're talking to young physicians or whoever it is, I'm like, you've made so many strides forward to get to this place. You went through, HE double hockey sticks and back just to become a doctor. And you owe a lot of people a lot of money. Your greatest single asset is your ability to go put on those scrubs and go operate every day. You need to ensure that with everything you've got, and so they will do it though and whatnot. So they're not the challenge that I have. But the facts are, if they don't have it, they accrue all this cash, they build it up, and then they're out for 2 years fighting cancer, and all of a sudden they just depleted all their cash, and they just got a third mortgage on their house, and they still owe $450,000 of student loans. So when you look at it from an asset protection, there's a conversation that we like to have with people because we're just trying to put fences around dollars. We're trying to cover the what ifs. We're trying to make sure that we have answers for everything for people because we know life throws you curveballs, and we're just trying to be able to at least foul them off or maybe hit them out there in the outfield somehow, some way. The disability space is interesting too. When you look at carriers, there was 50 carriers in 1980 that offered disability insurance. Today, there's 15. So there's a lot more that are getting out of the business than are getting into this business. It's a gray area. You get into this, are you really disabled? Are you not? Could you do something? Could you not? Could you flip burgers at McDonald's? Or so it's gray. And it is something a lot of people like to avoid and not talk about because they think in their head, well, I'm not going to be in a car wreck and be in a wheelchair the rest of my life. And I'm like, I agree. But could you ever have the risk of getting cancer? Have you ever had a heart attack or a stroke? Because those are the highest payers on disability insurance. They're the claimants. The actual accidents and injuries, very statistically low on actual payouts. Cancers, by far the highest. And you can beat it. But if you don't have a disability plan, you're going to burn up a whole bunch of wealth. And Brian's going to paper it and put it all in these trusts. And then all of a sudden, you're going to have to spend it all because you just had to beat cancer and your income dropped and went away completely. So, last piece. Okay with that? Last piece, long-term care insurance. This is the fun one. I had a client of mine, no offense to anybody, but he told me, last week, I said, hey, we need to have a conversation about something. And I was like, you're going to get offended when I say it. He goes, if you bring up that old people insurance, then I'm not talking to you. And I was like, okay, well then let's call it what it is. It's called long-term care insurance. But I was like, you need to start looking at this inside of your plan because the facts are you're at a point where you're still insurable and we need to get it before we actually have this risk in the future. Long-term care is such a unique animal. It is a massive risk we see. It's the number one risk that we see for retirees out there that you actually can put a plan in place for. You can't put a plan in place for what happens with taxes. You can try to minimize taxes with creative planning. You can't put a plan in place for what happens with inflation. You just have to deal with it. But you can put a plan in place for long-term care and put a fence around your assets, which will allow you to transfer so much more wealth to the next generation instead of, the burn rate again on a long-term care claim is just astronomical. Everybody in here has probably had some type of event in their life with a loved one and or close family member where you saw somebody in a facility and you saw the emotional stress and pressure put on, the family, the loved ones. But sometimes, not everybody always saw this, but if you ever saw the financial pressure that got put on it, it's mind-blowing. It's kind of disturbing. So we do a lot of this. We're very proactive in it. There was 18 carriers in this space in 2008. There's 8 now. These carriers don't want to touch it because they're extended claims. They're going on forever. We're keeping people alive forever. So, it's become a big animal. But a couple numbers that I thought you might find statistically interesting is claimants for this. The number one claimant for a long-term care claim in the industry is cognitive impairments, which is going to fall into dementia, Alzheimer's, those type of things. Cancer's number 2, strokes and heart attacks 3, neurological issues 4. So you look at those, it kind of ties into disability insurance. In Oklahoma, our numbers will go like this. Skilled nursing facility, if you need care in a skilled nursing facility, okay, just nursing home in Oklahoma, right now for a semi-private room, which nobody raises their hand for, okay, is $222 a day. That's the average number in the state of Oklahoma. For a private room, which everybody would raise their hand for, $261 a day. So, and I would tell you from a burn rate and asset protection and investment returns and things like that, if you're taking out, if you've got a cost that takes $6,000 to $7,000 to $8,000 a month for care, and you're in retirement, most of that money that you're taking out to pay that $8,000 a month is coming out of a qualified plan, which means it's coming out taxable to you. So you're not taking out $8,000 a month to pay the $8,000 bill. You're taking out $12,000. You take out $12,000 a month, and this average goes out 3.7 years for a nursing home. How much wealth did you just burn up? It's just astronomical. Assisted living runs around Oklahoma's $4,700 to $5,100 a month is a typical, that's an average. So most of the people in this room probably aren't seeking out the average facility. And then home health in the state of Oklahoma, that average for RN to come to your house is $116 per visit. They don't just come once a day. They typically are there multiple times a day. That's the highest cost. That number adds up, and that can exhaust resources at mock speed. So there's ways to plan around this. There's things you can do creatively, so there's just things I wanted to just kind of layer out there, tie it into some of the stuff that Brian was kind of focusing on with this asset protection, and also be the guy that gets to get up here and talk to you about becoming sick, injured, or dying. So, but all right, I'll hand it off. Bradley?
Thanks, Matt. I won't be as We'll do the fun stuff. Brian, is yours, you up, or mine?
I'll come back later.
All right. Brian, thanks, like Matt said, thanks for having me up here as well. I'd love to talk about investments. Brad Wallace, Stride Wealth Management. We are a trust company, so trust administration. So we administer the trust that Brian writes, and we manage assets, which is my team's job, my team's job. And when Brian asked me to come talk about asset protection strategies, I said I don't need 10 minutes to tell everybody not to buy Bitcoin. So I said, come anyway, here we are. But I did start thinking about what do we help on the investment management side? What do we help clients protect against in terms of managing their assets? And I came up with these three things. And these are probably somewhat commonsensical, but you got inflation, you got principal loss, permanent loss of capital, and most importantly, we had a lot of conversations with clients about this. Forget about what the S&P 500 is doing year to year. Forget about returns or even fees, volatility. But the biggest detriment to investor returns is yourself, is people, the emotions that are involved in that. So, behavioral finance is becoming an incredibly large subject or industry, but I think it's very, very important. So we'll spend a little bit of time on each here. But when I think about clients ask us to what do we do in wealth management, I've had a hard time explaining that in one sentence until I heard an author, Morgan Housel, who wrote the book Psychology of Money, fantastic book if you haven't read it. But he said, quote, "Getting rich and staying rich are two different skill sets." And I would say our business is the latter in that sense. It's helping people stay wealthy and transitioning that wealth in conjunction with Brian and Matt. So thinking about these three items here, the first one is inflation. Anybody heard that word recently? No one, interesting. Inflation's been top of mind, probably one of the most Googled terms over the past 18 months, for a good reason. Last June, so almost right at a year ago, year-over-year inflation in the U.S. was 9%, highest we've seen in 40 years. This morning, May inflation data came out. We're at 4% now, so we are effectively over half of what we were 12 months ago. Heading in the right direction, still double what we would like to be, which is 2% target. But inflation is real. We see it show up in the grocery stores. By the way, this morning, eggs fell down 14%. This morning's print. Eggs were the hot topic of the past 12 months. So those are finally down. You can take a breath of fresh air there. But inflation is real, and I think just in terms of numbers, that's the most important thing we're protecting clients' assets against is that purchasing power. As we know, at 6%, 9% inflation per year, cash assets are eroding in value every single year. If you're planning on transferring assets to multiple generations, you've got to at least keep up, sustain your purchasing power. So our job is to allocate and manage investments in a way that maintains purchasing power first and foremost. So how do we do this? We use marketable securities as we manage client investment portfolios. And a lot of people think about inflation hedging in terms of marketable securities as real estate, commodities. We think about these asset classes that are generally thought of as inflation hedges. Gold, which is not an inflation hedge over the long term, but we think of these things as inflation hedges. But I was at a conference about a month ago, and Dr. Jeremy Siegel, who's a professor at Wharton, fantastic finance mind, has done a lot of research on asset class returns over a long period of time, as this chart shows, 220 years, showing real returns. So what asset classes do best against inflation over a very long period of time, 220 years since 1802, and the answer unequivocally is equities, the stocks, at 6.7% real return on average every single year. And there's a lot of reasons for this. They're companies producing real cash by real people that have pricing power. But then you can see that it goes down. I don't know if you can see this, but the numbers are kind of small. Bonds for the past 220 years have averaged real returns of 3.5%. Bills that are treasury bills that are very popular today have averaged a real return of 2.5% for 220 years. Gold, like I said, not a great inflation hedge over the long term, 0.6% real return, and your average inflation over the past 220 years been about 1.5%. So the chart below, the conversation we have with clients that generally have a long time horizon, we're talking about generational wealth. Publicly traded stocks are fantastic assets, and we use them a lot for longevity, for inflation hedge, to maintain that purchasing power over the long term. What else do we protect against in terms of managing assets? It is permanent loss of capital, principal loss. And how do we do that? It's relatively simple. It's diversification, asset allocation. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. We help clients do this and allocate prudently. But I think it's also important to distinguish between, when it comes to permanent loss of capital, it's important to distinguish between an investment and a speculation. And this will help maintain your principal as well. But Warren Buffett's professor in Columbia, almost 80 years ago or so, Ben Graham, considered the father of value investing, he would define an investment as an operation in which, on thorough analysis, promises safety of principal and adequate return, and everything else is speculation. So we've got to be really, educational, with people we're working with, and explaining the difference, and the making sure that you're maintaining your principal and not experiencing permanent loss of capital is it's important to distinguish between the two. So speculative assets can cause permanent loss of capital, but what we do is help clients invest, and that is the safety of principal, adequate return. The other one's asset allocation. So our job too is to assemble a portfolio that fits that specific client and their needs and objectives in an optimized way. That's a fancy word to say, we want diversification through different asset classes that are not correlated to one another, uncorrelated. Bonds and stocks traditionally uncorrelated, except for 2022, among a couple other years. But usually, when stocks are doing poorly, bonds do well, and vice versa. That's a very simple form of diversification. So we're helping clients do that too. Spreading out, diversifying your assets are another way of protecting against permanent loss of capital. And lastly, like I said, most important, we help clients, and I would say our biggest value to our clients from the investment management side is not which hot stock is going to outperform tomorrow or next year, but helping you stay invested, stay on the bus, and stick to your strategy. Investors are their own worst enemy as humans. We're all emotional, and fortunately for me, not having emotions is great for investment management. It's terrible for marriage and relationship. My wife gets on me all the time. Opening Christmas presents is kind of awkward, but it's great. This is fantastic. No emotion. It's great for investing though. And we help people remove the emotion from their investment management strategy. But a couple interesting studies to show. One here on the bottom left is a chart from JP Morgan, and it shows different asset class returns over a 20-year period. A 60-40 portfolio over the past 20 years is averaged about 6.4% annualized return. The average investor averaged about 3% annualized return. There's many other studies that would show where an investment, the product, the fund, the stock achieved a certain level of return. The investor and the person investing in that asset achieved a significantly lower return. And it all boils down to timing, trying to time when to enter, time when to exit. Again, people with emotions and free will are our own worst enemies when it comes to investing. So Fidelity, interestingly enough, big generally known 401k company, several years ago did a study analyzing thousands of their client accounts from 2003 to 2013. And they wanted to see what type of accounts, what type of investor performed the best, and what were they doing. What they found over that 10-year period, over thousands of accounts, the best performing accounts. Can anybody guess what they were? Who were the owners of these best performing accounts? They happened to be matched beneficiaries, the dead people. The people that forgot about their account before they were dead and had left it alone, didn't touch it, were the best performing Fidelity accounts over that time period.
Brad mentioned something, fear, greed. Those are two strong emotions as the attorney in the room, I get to play a little bit on the protecting other people's greed. So I'm glad that Brad brought that up. I'm also very glad that Matt mentioned something about playing defense and about being aware of the emotions that come through this and about insurance that comes with this. And so we are going to talk about insurance that you have to have in place prior to needing it. A legal strategy to asset protection is a little bit different than the asset as far as investments go, as Brad mentioned. And so there are quite a few vehicles out there that you need to be in prior to a lawsuit coming. So what can we do for these things? They're out there, you've heard about them. One is a family wealth preservation trust. And so this is a statute that says that you can't be sued. Anything you put inside this family wealth preservation trust, according to the statutes of Oklahoma, say you can't be sued for that money. It's 100% asset or creditor protected, but in the real world, it's never been tested. To my knowledge, and I'm not the smartest guy in the room, of course, there's not a case in Oklahoma that's tested this family wealth preservation trust. So a lot of people like this, and it sounds great, but it's like buying a boat that's never been in the water. Who wants to go first to try to get this boat in the water, see if it really works, right? We're all sitting around waiting for one of these family wealth preservation trusts to be tested out. Another thing is a homestead protection. We play the game all the time with greed and fear for ourselves, right? I was talking to a client the other day, and he said, oh, I've got $400,000 in cash. That's a lot of money. And I'm investing it at a bank at 5% interest rate. Very proud of his interest rate. And I said, well, why don't you pay off your house? He goes, because I got my mortgage at 2.6. I'm just playing the arbitrage game. Look how much money I'm earning 5, and I'm paying 2.6. And I said, well, let me help you look at the problem differently. If my client gets sued, he's an independent contractor. They can take all of his money. What if he took that cash and paid off his bank, paid off his loan? He now has a homestead exemption. And those assets are locked up, and those are judgment-proof by statute, right? So he's not any richer on his balance sheet. His balance sheet says he's worth the same, but he's moved that asset into paying off his debt. So now he has protected himself from his creditors. Now, that's a defensive play, isn't it, right? He's keeping cash on hand because he thinks he can make more money out of it. That's greed driving that. I'm all for greed. I'm all for growing and being intelligent with your assets, but we're looking at the problem just a little bit differently. Caution with the homestead, though. You need to file it with the county. If you haven't done that, it's fairly easy to do, but we all should file for a homestead exemption on our houses. So we have that. So if you haven't done it, go home and look up on the county assessment website how to file for homestead exemption. Another asset that's protected by federal statute and Oklahoma statute are ERISA accounts and IRAs. So we'll talk about ERISA 401ks. They're generally protected, right? Not all the time. And as every good attorney, you can see the word generally. Attorneys don't speak in absolutes, because you just never know all the details. But generally, 401ks are protected from creditors. So if you're with a company and the company's got a 401k, you can keep putting assets in there, and if you get sued, right, that 401k is protected. The government wants you to keep your retirement intact. So assets that are in 401k are generally creditor protected. IRAs and Roth IRAs, generally protected from creditors, not federally though. So if you get sued in federal court, your IRA is not 100% protected. But Oklahoma, yes. Oklahoma IRAs and Roth IRAs are generally protected from creditors. And so most of our lawsuits are going to be found in district courts, and most of your lawsuits are going to come from state creditors at the state level. So an IRA and a Roth IRA is a great way to protect assets. Okay, well, how do we really do that, right? How do we really put stuff in the IRA? Because you guys are sitting there thinking, well, $5,000 a year, and money's relative, right? I mean, I don't let my kids get a drink when we go to Brahms, because that's an extra $2. We'll get a drink at home. So I'm very cheap. I'm very frugal with my assets. But $5,000 into a retirement IRA is not very much. Well, Well, there are other avenues out there. There's SEP IRAs. SEP IRAs allow $66,000 a year contributions into an IRA. So now we're starting to move the needle a little bit on moving assets and transferring wealth. And year over year, that starts to add up. Now, SEP IRAs have some limits on there. There's a total compensation limit, some other qualifications that you have to do. The IRAs are also protected from bankruptcy at the federal level. So again, those of you who are used to playing offense and being aggressive, IRAs are a great protection and great downside hedge against some things that could go possibly way wrong. And so now we're going to talk about LLCs. Matt mentioned put a fence around your assets. And the LLC is probably the most tried and true limited liability company. That's what that means. Our government says, great, we don't want all the business owners to take risk personally, so you can take a risk by limiting your liability, which you put in there. We all know how those LLCs work. They're very effective tools. Sometimes people have multiple LLCs. I will caution you, be careful how you run your LLC. We have a great litigation arm. And so when I was preparing this, I went, and we frequently do with our estate plans, we take them to our litigation team, and I ask them, hey, poke a hole in this. And sometimes they get pretty creative. They look at the books and say, well, there's the weakness right there. And so if you have an LLC, a lot of us do in this room, and you're not treating it separate from you, if you're buying your cheeseburgers out of your LLC, and Brad's buying his kind of unemotional Christmas presents out of his LLC, our litigators will get right through that. So make sure when you have your LLCs and your business structures, make sure you're structured correctly. And make sure you're keeping your books very clean. That helps cut that off. So you can't just build a fence. You need to keep that gate closed. I'm going to continue with that analogy. So it's very important that if you build an LLC, you treat it correctly. We have a client that has a large liquidity event coming up, very, very cautious on his investments, his assets. We advised him to put all of his vehicles and all of his equipment inside one LLC, because if he gets sued, that's probably where the accident's going to come from, right? So you can take your risky assets and begin to set those inside separate LLCs. Now, he also has somebody to do books for him, so he doesn't have to juggle all those different hoops, so it's a good thing to do. The last two things I want to talk about before we open up the questions are irrevocable trust. A lot of clients say, I hear about these irrevocable trusts, and I want this, I read an article, and I want an irrevocable trust. And so I asked them, well, that's great. It's almost total protection, but it's almost total loss of control. And I explained to them, if you do an irrevocable trust and you name your favorite attorney as a beneficiary of your irrevocable trust, just kidding, don't name them, unless you really want to. If you name your favorite attorney as your beneficiary and you sign an irrevocable trust, it is in fact irrevocable. Now sometimes that's a good tool in the toolbox to set an asset aside, but you have to be very careful. A lot of people want to use that asset after they fund it, and it can't be the only tool in the toolbox. So be very careful when you do that. You know, Matt's had a lot of experience drafting those, and when they house the insurance product, they're a very effective tool as you begin to set that aside. As that policy grows and it's funded, it is a very tried and true, very effective tool to pass assets on. And then you can set up your successive generations, pay tax bills. It's a very elegant solution to that. But remember, when you set it up, you do lose control from it. I cannot tell you, the last thing I'm going to talk about is offshore accounts. How many people read articles in Forbes, respected magazines, and they talk about offshore accounts? Or maybe they saw a social media influencer mention offshore accounts. But what no one really knows is that the government is really tired of offshore accounts. And so, true story, gentleman had $8 million put in an offshore account. The judge said, hey, bring that money back. Well, we can't collect it. The court system couldn't reach out and grab that money. He said, bring the money back. And the guy said, well, you can't force me to do it. The judge said, well, I'm going to hold you in contempt until you do. He went to prison for 6 years. When he got out, he had his money, but he lost 6 years of his life because the judge held him in contempt. So be very careful with offshore accounts. It is not worth it. Lastly, on offshore accounts, I want to talk about the Foreign Asset Tax Compliance Act. The IRS is saying if you have an offshore account that's holding marketable securities, we're going to go ahead and tax that as if it's held here in the United States. So you're not getting away with tax evasion either. That's not acceptable. And one of the primary things when you're talking about these legal assets, these legal protections, these legal vehicles, is intent. I use the word generally through here. So I'll pick on Matt and Brad. These are very smart guys. If they have a lawsuit coming, and I'm sure you guys would never be sued, of course, but if you had something coming, something was on the horizon, and you started to build these strategies, you started to form an LLC, you started to do an irrevocable trust, you started to form this wealth preservation trust, the government's going to call that fraudulent transfer. You are transferring these assets to avoid something bad coming, and our statutes don't allow that. So you need to be proactive when you do these. Your LLCs need to be set up, your preservation trust needs to be set up, your insurance trust need to be set up well in advance. You cannot build a fence too late. So what we're really talking about here, all three of us are talking about being intentional. Be intentional with your estate plan. Know what you want it to do and take proactive steps. Be intentional with your insurance. Know the problem you're trying to solve. Know the thing that you're looking for peace of mind, and be intentional. Be intentional with your assets. You know, Brad talks about it all the time. Behavioral finance is a real problem because we get in the middle of it. We mess it up. But if you're intentional, seek advisors and seek counselors who can help you with those problems. So we really want to educate everybody here to know that you have the ability to be proactive. You have the ability to be intentional. Sticking your head in the sand and ignoring any one of these things is not an effective strategy. Hope, it might be great. It is great on Sunday mornings, but it's not great in the asset world. It's not great with your estate plan. It's not great with insurance. Matt said something earlier about protecting your biggest asset. And for a surgeon, for an attorney, for an architect, if you are your biggest asset, you need to take steps to protect it with disability insurance. Brad mentioned another common theme here. Make sure you're protected with good counselors. Make sure you have good advisors in your room to protect you from yourself. What we're talking about is being proactive in your strategy. So we are out of time. That wraps us up. I know I'll be here. There's some other attorneys from our office that would love to visit with you. We'll be at that. Josh will be over there at that table. We'd love to get your name and number and reach out to you. If you have any questions or comments, and before that, I'll open up the floor for a few quick general questions. And sometimes questions can be specific, so if we have to punt on those and talk about those individually, we can. But are there any general questions for Brad or Matt? None for me. I don't have anything to add, or anything for these guys. Okay. Well, I can't tell you. Yes.
You mentioned in the homestead exemption that your example was a gentleman paid off a loan or a mortgage. That in itself did not give it the exemption. It was just a strategy to protect more assets, right?
That's correct. If his house if he had filed for the homestead exemption, the Oklahoma law says your house is exempt from creditors. So by moving their money into that from the left hand to the right hand, again, his balance sheet didn't change, but that money is exempt from, his house is now exempt from creditors. So yeah, very much. But you got to get that homestead filed. We had a client who didn't, thought he did, lawsuit came, and can't go back in time and fix that. Really, really wish he would have just checked one box and he would have saved himself hundreds of thousands of dollars. Again, thank you for coming. Thank you for Rose Creek. This is a great place. They've done a great job with food. There's some more food out there to help yourself in seconds. And thank you guys for coming. We appreciate it, and we'd love to stick around and answer any questions that you guys have. Thank you.